My brother David and I have always been into exploring abandoned places. We call it urban camping, heading out to forgotten spots, setting up for the night, and just seeing what stories the place tells us. It's our way of combining two things we love: the outdoors and the thrill of exploring places that time left behind. Last spring, we heard about an old summer camp just outside our town. It had been shut down in the early 90s after some kind of financial scandal, and nature had taken it back. The cabins were overgrown, paths washed out, and the lake supposedly covered in algae. We figured it would make a perfect spot for our next adventure. We loaded our gear and drove out, taking a back road that cut through the dense woods. The old wooden sign at the entrance still read, "Camp Winding Pines," half fallen and covered in moss. We parked the car a ways down the road and hiked in. The place was as creepy as you'd expect: broken windows, rotting cabins, the smell of wet wood and mold. The main lodge was falling apart, but a few of the smaller cabins seemed intact. We picked one that still had a roof and set up our gear inside. The plan was simple: camp out for the night, maybe shoot some video to share with our friends, and head back in the morning. After setting up, we explored the rest of the camp. The fire pit in the center of the grounds was filled with old, charred wood. David pointed out something odd: a set of recent footprints in the mud, leading from the pit to the tree line. They weren't ours. "Maybe someone else is camping out here," I said. David didn't look convinced. We moved on to check out the lake, which was indeed covered in a thick layer of green algae. The small pier jutted out, half submerged. I took a few photos while David skimmed stones across the water. That's when we found the traps. They were crude but effective, pits covered with thin branches and leaves. One had partially collapsed, revealing sharp wooden spikes at the bottom. Someone had definitely set these recently. David's face went pale. "Dude, this isn't just some old camp," he muttered. "Someone's trying to keep people out." We were debating whether to pack up and leave when we heard a sharp, metallic clanging from back near the cabins. We froze, straining to hear. Then came a faint, distant humming, like someone singing. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. David nodded, gripping his pocket knife tighter. We made our way back to the cabin cautiously, keeping low. As we approached, we noticed something that made my stomach drop. Our campfire had been lit. The wood was crackling, flames licking up into the air. We hadn't lit it. I signaled for David to stay quiet as we crept closer. There was no one around. Our sleeping bags were still spread out, and nothing seemed disturbed, except for the fire. We put it out quickly, both of us too freaked out to speak. Then I saw it, a small wooden carving on the ground near the fire pit. It was shaped like a human figure, roughly carved, with a noose around its neck. David picked it up and turned it over, revealing a word scratched into the back: "Leave." We heard movement from the trees behind us, something heavy moving through the brush. I grabbed my backpack, and David did the same. We agreed without speaking that it was time to go. Just as we were about to leave the cabin, David stopped me, pointing to the path leading back to the road. A series of makeshift traps had appeared, sharp sticks angled upward, and thin wires strung at ankle height. Whoever was out there didn't want us leaving that way. We decided to head toward the lake instead, thinking we could follow the shoreline to another path. As we moved, the singing started again, closer this time. It sounded like a lullaby, sung in a low, raspy voice. We ducked into the tall grass near the pier, trying to stay hidden. That's when we saw him, a tall, gaunt man in filthy clothes, carrying a long stick with something tied to the end. He walked slowly, like he was in no hurry, humming that same tune. He passed right by our cabin, paused at the door, and looked inside. I held my breath. After what felt like hours, he continued walking toward the lake, stopping at the spot where we had found the traps earlier. He knelt down and adjusted one of the pits, making sure the branches covered it completely. Then he turned and looked right at us. David and I bolted, running through the woods parallel to the lake. We heard him crashing through the brush behind us, his humming now louder, almost a chant. We didn't stop until we hit the road and practically threw ourselves into the car. As we drove off, I looked back one last time. The man was standing at the edge of the woods, watching us leave, the stick still in his hand. We never reported it. Part of me didn't want to know what he was doing out there. I've heard rumors since then about disappearances near the camp, about people going missing while hiking in those woods. I try not to think about it. David and I haven't been back to Camp Winding Pines. We still go camping sometimes, but always in busy, well-populated areas. I can't shake the feeling that we barely escaped that night. Sometimes, when I'm lying in my tent, I think I hear that humming soft, distant, but getting closer. I've been working in demolition for over a decade, and I've seen my fair share of strange things inside old buildings. But nothing comes close to what happened during a job we did last year. We were tasked with tearing down an old municipal building that had been condemned for years. The place had served as a government office back in the 60s, but after being closed in the early 90s, it was just left to rot. Our first task was to clear out the basement, where most of the old archives and office supplies had been stored. The stairs leading down were cracked, and the air smelled of mildew and something stale. As we started pulling out rusted filing cabinets, one of the guys, Steve, called me over. "Hey, boss, check this out," he said, pointing to a hatch in the floor partially hidden under a collapsed shelving unit. The hatch was metal, rusted around the edges, and bolted shut. It wasn't on any of the building plans we had. We pried it open with a crowbar, and the hinges screamed as the hatch lifted. Below was a narrow ladder leading down into the dark. Steve shone his flashlight and whistled. "There's a whole other room down there." We radioed our supervisor, but he just told us to check it out and see if there was anything worth salvaging. I led the way down, my flashlight beam bouncing off the damp concrete walls. The room at the bottom wasn't big, maybe 15 by 20 feet, but it was packed with old cots, canned food, and a makeshift cooking station. It looked like someone had been living there, but it didn't make sense. The cans were ancient, the blankets rotted, but everything was meticulously arranged. The most unsettling part was a table pushed against the far wall. On it sat an old radio, buzzing with low static, and a journal wrapped in plastic. Steve opened the journal and flipped through the brittle pages. Most of it was illegible, faded from time and moisture. One entry caught my attention, though. It was dated February 1993, just before the building was shut down. It read, "Saw them again today. Men with rifles. They keep patrolling. Can't let them find me. Must stay quiet. Must stay hidden." I felt a chill and looked around the room again, noticing something I'd missed before: scratch marks on the door leading to a narrow tunnel. The marks looked desperate, like someone had tried to claw their way out. Steve gave me a look, clearly spooked. "This isn't right," he muttered. I agreed. We decided to head back up and report what we found. Just as we started climbing, the radio crackled. At first, I thought it was just more static, but then I heard it faint, rhythmic tapping. "Did you hear that?" Steve whispered. I nodded, straining to listen. The tapping grew louder, almost like footsteps on concrete. Then it stopped abruptly. We scrambled up the ladder, and just as Steve reached the top, he froze. "Boss, the hatch." I looked up and saw it too. The hatch was closing. I barely managed to stick my crowbar in the gap before it slammed shut. We pushed it open, both of us breathing hard, and climbed out. We sealed the hatch and moved a heavy filing cabinet over it. I wasn't about to take any chances. After that, we reported everything to our supervisor and were told to focus on clearing the rest of the basement. The next day, we came back with more guys, but something was off. The hatch had been uncovered, and the filing cabinet was pushed aside. The hatch itself was sealed tight again, and the bolts were rusted over, like no one had touched it in years. Steve swore up and down that someone was messing with us, but none of the other guys had even been down there. I couldn't shake the feeling that we disturbed something that should have been left alone. About a week later, the building was scheduled for demolition. On the morning of the demo, we got a call that the site had been vandalized overnight. When we arrived, we found fresh footprints leading from the basement door to the middle of the lot, where they just stopped. That evening, while the building was being torn down, one of the demo crew noticed something strange. Buried under a layer of concrete in the basement, they found another hatch, this one newer, welded shut and covered in warning signs. None of us knew what to make of it. The city didn't have any records of a secondary shelter or why it had been sealed. After the building was leveled, we were told to forget about it and move on to the next job. A few weeks later, I did some digging. Turns out, in the early 90s, the building had been used temporarily as an emergency shelter during a riot. There were reports of a few people never making it out, but no official records were kept. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that someone or something was still down there, hiding in that forgotten room. Every now and then, I dream about that radio crackling to life and the sound of those footsteps getting closer. My Uncle Joe and I have been in the demolition business for years. We've torn down everything from old factories to decrepit houses, but nothing has ever left me as shaken as that abandoned prison job. The prison had been closed since the early 80s after a series of violent incidents led to its sudden shutdown. The city planned to redevelop the area, so they hired us to clear out the debris and remove anything salvageable. It was a big contract, and Uncle Joe was thrilled. I wasn't so sure. The place gave me the creeps just looking at it. Massive stone walls, rusted gates, and barbed wire still clinging to the fence like brittle skeleton fingers. We started on the administrative block, clearing out old filing cabinets, desks, and piles of paper that had turned to mush from years of water damage. Once that was done, we moved on to the cell blocks. Most of the cells were empty, just rusted bunks and stained mattresses, but the echoes inside that place made it feel like you were never alone. On the second day, we moved to cell block B. That's when we found it. One cell, right at the end of the row, was still locked. Most of the others had their doors jammed open or rusted off their hinges, but this one was pristine, padlocked with a shiny new chain. Uncle Joe grumbled about people messing around, thinking maybe some urban explorers had tried to secure it. It took some effort, but we finally managed to cut through the chain and pull the door open. As the cell creaked wide, the smell hit us, not the stale, moldy air we'd gotten used to, but something fresher, like sweat and stale food. Inside, it didn't look like the other cells. The bed had a clean bedroll neatly tucked in, and there was a stack of plastic food containers on the small metal table. An open notebook lay on top, filled with neat handwriting. I picked it up and read a few lines. They patrol at night. I stay quiet. Can't let them hear me. The guards still think I'm here. Chills ran up my spine. "Hey, Joe, check this out," I said, but he was too busy inspecting the containers. "These aren't that old," he said, holding one up. The expiration date was only a few months back. That didn't make sense. The place had been locked up for decades. I flipped through the notebook, but the entries were repetitive paranoia about guards, mentions of hiding, and constant fear of being found. One line was underlined several times. "They know I'm still here." As we were trying to make sense of it, we heard a clank from the hallway. I jumped, and Uncle Joe cursed. We both rushed out to see what caused it, but the corridor was empty. Then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of another cell door slamming shut a few rows down. We both froze, listening. I whispered, "You think someone's in here with us?" Uncle Joe shook his head, more annoyed than scared. "Probably just a raccoon or something. Come on." We moved down the row cautiously, but every cell was still open. No sign of movement. We returned to the locked cell to grab the notebook, but it wasn't on the table where I'd left it. I swear I hadn't moved it. We searched the room, but it was just gone. Joe muttered something about the damn building playing tricks on us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had taken it while we were distracted. We decided to secure the block and take a break. As we headed out, I glanced back and noticed something that made my stomach drop. The cell door was closed again. We hadn't touched it. I asked Joe if he'd shut it, but he swore he hadn't. I pulled on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The new chain was back, looped around the bars, as if we'd never cut it. We hurried out to call the site supervisor, and when we returned with him a few hours later, the chain was gone. The door hung open, just like we'd left it after cutting the lock. The notebook was back on the table. I flipped through it again, but the last page had changed. There was a new entry, written in the same neat handwriting. "They're getting closer. Can't let them see me. Must hide." The supervisor was pissed, accusing us of messing around, but Joe swore up and down that something was wrong with that place. We finished the job a few days later, but every time we went back to cell block B, I felt like we were being watched. A few weeks after the demolition, I did some digging online. Turns out, just before the prison closed, there was a rumor that one of the inmates had never been accounted for. A guard reported seeing someone moving around at night, but after a thorough search, they never found anyone. The guard swore he saw someone slip into a cell just before the building was shut down, but nobody believed him. I still think about that notebook, the entries that seemed to change when we weren't looking. I can't help but wonder, was someone really hiding in that cell for decades, convinced the guards were still patrolling? Or did someone make that space their secret home long after the place was abandoned? Either way, I'm just glad we never found out who was writing those notes. I work in building restoration, mostly old municipal and historical buildings that are set to be renovated or repurposed. Last year, I got assigned to a project that still haunts me, an abandoned library that had been closed for nearly 20 years. The city wanted to turn it into a community center, but first, they needed it cleared out, cataloged, and prepped for renovations. When I first saw the place, it looked like something out of a horror movie. The windows were caked with grime, vines had crawled their way through cracked walls, and the whole building seemed to groan under the weight of its own neglect. I was tasked with the basement, supposedly filled with old books, shelving units, and forgotten equipment. The basement was a mess of toppled shelves and scattered papers. I started organizing what I could, trying to figure out what was worth keeping. That's when I noticed something odd. One of the far walls didn't match the rest. It looked newer, like it had been hastily built to seal something off. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started moving shelves out of the way. Behind them, partially hidden, was a door metal with a thick padlock on it. I figured it was just a utility room or old storage, but it wasn't on the blueprints. I radioed my supervisor, but he didn't know anything about it. He gave me the go-ahead to break the lock since the city wanted a full assessment. After a bit of prying and a lot of swearing, the lock finally gave. I pulled the door open. In a rush of stale, cold air hit me. Behind the door was a narrow stone staircase leading down, much deeper than the rest of the basement. I almost turned back, but something about the hidden passage pulled me in. I grabbed my flashlight and started down. At the bottom, I found a long, low tunnel lined with exposed brick. The air was damp, and the smell of mold was overpowering. As I moved further in, I noticed something strange, faded newspapers scattered along the floor, most dated from just a few months ago. One of them was about a local man who had gone missing. I kept moving, and soon I found the source of the smell, a makeshift living space tucked into a side alcove. There were cots lined up against the wall, old blankets piled on top, and food wrappers scattered around. Some of the food was fresh. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Then I saw the notebook. It was lying on one of the cots, open to a page filled with neat, blocky handwriting. They watch at night. Must stay quiet. Can't be seen. I flipped through the pages, and it was full of similar notes, paranoid ramblings about them coming into the tunnels and taking people. My flashlight beam caught a row of crude tally marks scratched into the wall, at least 100 of them. That's when I heard footsteps coming from deeper down the tunnel. Slow, deliberate. I froze, straining to listen. They stopped, and I whispered into my radio, telling my supervisor someone might be living down here. He told me to leave immediately and wait for security, but I couldn't move. My curiosity held me in place. The footsteps started again, getting closer. I killed my flashlight, hoping to stay unnoticed. Then I saw him, a gaunt figure stepping into the edge of the light, carrying a small, dim lantern. His clothes were tattered, his face sunken and hollow. He muttered to himself as he moved past, completely oblivious to me hiding in the shadows. He headed toward the living space, and I used the opportunity to sneak back up the stairs. Just as I reached the top, I heard his voice echo up the tunnel. "They're here. They're back." I slammed the door shut and threw a metal shelf in front of it. My hands were shaking as I radioed again, demanding backup. Security and the city officials showed up, and we tried to open the door again, but something had jammed it from the inside. The next day, contractors came to seal off the tunnel completely, under orders from the city. No explanation was given, just that the space was unsafe. I tried asking around, but no one would give me a straight answer. A few weeks later, I saw a news report about another person going missing downtown. The article mentioned a witness who claimed they saw a man lurking near the library late at night, mumbling to himself. I couldn't help but wonder if it was the same guy I saw down there, and if he was still living in those tunnels, just moving deeper underground to avoid being found. I haven't gone back to that site since. I've done plenty of other jobs, but none have ever made me feel as uneasy as that one. Sometimes I lie awake at night, thinking about that tunnel and those desperate, scratchy notes. I wonder if there are more tunnels under the city, hidden away like that one, filled with people who don't want to be found. I work as a structural engineer, and one of my main gigs is assessing old buildings slated for demolition. It's usually straightforward work: take measurements, check for any hazardous materials, and make sure the building isn't going to collapse on us while we clear it out. But a few months ago, I took on a job that still gives me the creeps. It was an old power plant on the outskirts of town. Built in the 60s, it had been shut down after an accident in the early 90s. The story was that a generator explosion killed 2 workers, and after that, the place was deemed unsafe. They just sealed it up and left it to decay. My job was to inspect the structure before the demo team moved in. It was supposed to be routine, just another day on the job. I showed up early in the morning, my equipment packed and ready. The main gate was padlocked, but it looked like someone had already cut through it recently. I thought it might have been the demo team doing some preliminary work. Inside, the plant was a maze of rusted walkways, corroded pipes, and broken windows. Birds had taken over, and the sound of fluttering wings echoed through the cavernous space. I made my way to the central control room, where most of the structural plans were supposed to be stored. The door was jammed, but after a bit of pushing, it gave way. The control room was like a time capsule, faded safety posters on the walls, a dusty coffee cup still on the console, and stacks of old blueprints piled on the floor. I started going through the documents, looking for the original plans. One of the folders caught my attention. It was marked Incident Reports and looked out of place among the engineering documents. I flipped it open and found a series of notes about the explosion. Most of it was routine stuff, safety violations, maintenance logs, but one page stood out. In the margins, someone had scribbled, "They sabotaged it." I have proof. Meet me in the crawl space under Generator 3. I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd heard rumors about the explosion being suspicious, but nothing concrete. I made a mental note to check it out later. Continuing my inspection, I moved toward the generator room. The floor creaked ominously underfoot, and more than once, I had to navigate around collapsed beams and broken catwalks. As I approached Generator 3, I noticed something odd, a hatch on the floor that wasn't marked on any of the plans. Curiosity got the better of me. I pried it open and found a narrow crawl space below. I climbed down, squeezing through the tight opening, and flicked on my flashlight. The air was thick, and the walls were covered in old, stained insulation. At the end of the crawl space, I found a makeshift living area, a cot, a camping stove, and stacks of notebooks. It looked like someone had been living down there recently. I picked up one of the notebooks and flipped through it. It was filled with detailed sketches of the generator layout, notes about maintenance routines, and accusations, lots of them. The writer claimed that the explosion had been deliberate, planned by someone high up to cover up safety violations. The last page had a scrawled note. "They know I'm onto them. If something happens to me, the proof is in the core conduit." I heard a noise above me, the faint sound of footsteps. I killed my flashlight and held my breath. The footsteps stopped right above the hatch, and I could hear muffled voices. One of them said, "Did you hear that?" I stayed perfectly still, waiting for them to move on. After a few tense minutes, the voices faded. I didn't dare move until I was sure they were gone. When I climbed back up, the control room door, which I had left open, was now shut. I carefully approached and pushed it open, but no one was there. I decided to check the core conduit mentioned in the notes. It was located behind Generator 3, under a rusty grate. I pried it open and shone my light inside. Wedged into the metal piping was a small waterproof case. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were photographs, close-ups of damaged safety valves, leaking coolant lines, and handwritten notes detailing how someone had deliberately weakened the generator's pressure system. I knew this was big. I took photos of everything with my phone and secured the case. Just as I was about to leave, I heard the door to the generator room slam. I froze, listening. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of something being dragged across the floor, like a metal pipe scraping against concrete. I peered around the corner and saw a man in a maintenance uniform, his face grimy and hollow-eyed, pulling a heavy tool cart. I hadn't seen anyone else on site that morning. I backed away slowly and made my way to the exit, careful not to make any noise. When I finally got outside, I called my supervisor and reported what I found. By the time the authorities arrived, the man was gone, and the living space in the crawl space had been cleared out, no sign of the notebooks or the cot. The police did an investigation, but they couldn't confirm anything. The demo team went ahead with the demolition a few weeks later. I handed over my photos to the city safety board, but I never heard anything about it after that. Sometimes I think about that man in the crawl space. How long had he been hiding down there, living among the rusted machines and the memories of that accident? Had he been a survivor, or someone who knew too much and had to hide? I still don't know who sabotaged the generator, but I'm convinced that someone wanted to cover it up, and that man in the shadows knew the truth. I just hope he got out before they buried the place in rubble. My friends and I were big into urban exploration. You know, breaking into old, forgotten places and filming everything for our little YouTube channel. We didn't make much money from it, but it was more about the thrill than anything else. One night, Jake found out about an abandoned shopping mall on the edge of town that had been closed down for almost a decade. It was set to be demolished soon, and we wanted to get in before it was gone for good. It was supposed to be a quick in and out. We arrived around midnight, cutting through the chain-link fence on the side where it had already rusted and buckled. The place looked like a tomb, cracked windows, graffiti everywhere, and the giant sign out front half collapsed. Jake, Emily, and I squeezed through a busted service door and found ourselves inside what used to be a department store. The place was massive. Our flashlights barely made a dent in the darkness. Broken mannequins littered the floor, some missing limbs, others leaning at odd angles. The escalators had long since rusted solid, and the faint echo of dripping water was the only sound. Emily set up her camera, doing the typical introduction for our video while Jake and I scouted ahead. We decided to head toward the food court first. As we walked, we passed by old storefronts with shattered windows and displays still set up, frozen in time. We were almost at the food court when Jake nudged me. "Did you see that?" he whispered. I hadn't, but I followed his gaze to the second-floor balcony. There, just barely visible in the dim light, was a figure standing perfectly still. "Probably just a mannequin," I whispered back, trying to sound confident. Jake zoomed in with his camera, but the figure didn't move. We watched for a while before convincing ourselves it was just some leftover store display. The food court was a mess. Broken tables, overturned chairs, and a layer of grime covered the floor. We spread out to look for anything interesting to film. Emily wandered over to the old pizza place. Jake checked out the pretzel counter, and I stayed in the middle, trying to get a panoramic shot. That's when I noticed something strange. On one of the tables was a crumpled fast food wrapper that didn't look nearly as old as everything else. I picked it up and saw it still had grease spots, definitely not a decade old. Before I could call the others, I heard a loud clang behind me. I spun around to see Jake staring up at the balcony again, eyes wide. The figure was gone. "Did you see where it went?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Jake shook his head, his camera still aimed upward. Emily joined us, confused by the sudden tension. We decided to move on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After about half an hour of exploring, we returned to the spot where we'd stashed our bags. I reached for mine to grab a water bottle, but it wasn't there. Neither were Jake's or Emily's. "Maybe we left them at the entrance," Emily suggested, though I knew that wasn't true. Panic started to creep in as we realized our phones had been in those bags. Just then, we heard a faint whistling from somewhere behind us, slow, almost melodic. We froze, listening as it echoed through the mall. "We need to get out of here," I whispered. Jake agreed, but as we made our way back, we heard footsteps from the level above us, keeping pace. Whoever it was seemed to be trailing us, never getting too close, but never too far either. We picked up speed, practically jogging down the corridors, trying to find the exit. The whistling grew louder, more deliberate, like it was moving directly above us. We finally made it to the department store where we'd come in. As we approached the door, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A fresh chain had been looped around the broken door handle, padlocked from the outside. Someone had locked us in. Jake frantically yanked at the chain while Emily tried calling for help with the one phone she'd kept in her pocket. No signal. The whistling stopped. Then, from the shadows at the far end of the store, we saw him. A man, dirty and disheveled, holding one of our backpacks. He just stood there, staring at us. "Hey, that's ours," Jake shouted. The man didn't react. He just kept staring, slowly tilting his head to the side like he was studying us. Then he dropped the bag and took a step forward. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. We sprinted to the back of the store, looking for any way out. I spotted a side door we hadn't noticed before, partially blocked by a fallen shelf. We squeezed through just as the man's footsteps echoed behind us. Once outside, we didn't stop running until we reached the car. We never saw the guy again, but when we looked back, we could just make out his silhouette at the door, still watching us as we peeled out of there. A few days later, I checked the news, but there was nothing about the mall or anyone living there. We never uploaded the footage. In fact, we never went back to that place, and we stopped urban exploring altogether. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about the way he watched us. I can't help but wonder if we stumbled onto someone's hidden life, someone who wasn't happy about being found. I work for a small construction company that takes on renovation projects in old, abandoned buildings. Last year, we got a contract to convert an old psychiatric hospital into upscale apartments. The place had been closed down for decades after a series of funding cuts, and the city had pretty much forgotten about it. From the outside, it looked like any other decaying building, boarded up windows, graffiti everywhere, and rusted gates. My crew and I started on the main floor, ripping out the old fixtures and gutting the walls. The building plans we had were outdated, but they were all we had to go on. On the third day, we were clearing out the administrative wing when one of the guys, Paul, called me over. He'd found a door that wasn't on the plans. It was padlocked, and the rust on the chain suggested it hadn't been opened in a long time. I radioed the site manager, and he told us to open it up and document whatever was inside. It took some effort, but we eventually snapped the old lock. The door groaned open, revealing a hallway that didn't match any of the blueprints. It was narrow, with cracked tile floors and peeling paint, leading to a series of small rooms. Curiosity got the better of us, and we split up to check out the rooms. Each one was the size of a walk-in closet, with nothing but old, rusty bed frames bolted to the floor. The air was musty, and the silence was almost suffocating. At the end of the hall was a small office, cluttered with ancient paperwork and a few cracked filing cabinets. On the desk, there was a yellowed, handwritten sign that read, "Observation records, keep locked." I rifled through the papers, but most of it was illegible. One document caught my eye, though. It was a list of patient names and room numbers, but the dates were all from the early 90s, right before the hospital shut down. As I was flipping through the pages, Paul called out from one of the rooms. I rushed over and found him staring at the wall, where faded writing was scrawled in a jagged, hasty hand. They never left. We both felt uneasy, but I chalked it up to some old graffiti. We reported the find to the site manager, but he just shrugged it off as part of the building's weird history. A few days later, while doing demolition on the main floor, I noticed something strange. Paul wasn't around, and when I asked the crew, they said he hadn't shown up that morning. I called his cell, but it went straight to voicemail. That night, I stayed late to finish some paperwork. As I was wrapping up, I heard footsteps echoing from the second floor. I knew no one was supposed to be up there, so I grabbed my flashlight and went to check it out. As I reached the hallway where we'd found the locked door, I noticed it was closed again. I was sure we'd left it open. I pulled it back, and to my shock, there was no hallway behind it, just a solid brick wall. Panic set in as I checked the other side of the wall from the adjacent room, but it was solid. It didn't make sense. I called the site manager, but he just told me to lock up and go home. The next morning, the police were on site. They were looking for Paul. Apparently, he hadn't come home for 2 days. We searched the whole building, but there was no trace of him. The weird part was that the hallway we'd found was completely gone, like it never existed. A week later, we were clearing out the basement when one of the guys found a set of old security tapes in a locked utility closet. Curious, I loaded one into a portable player. The footage was grainy, showing the same hallway we'd found. The camera was positioned at the far end, aimed down the length of the corridor. At first, it was just static and flickering. Then I saw movement, Paul, walking down the hall, looking at the rooms. Suddenly, he stopped and turned around, like he'd heard something. Then the screen went black. When the video resumed, the camera had been repositioned to face the door from the inside. The hallway looked different, cleaner, like it had been back in the 90s. I could just make out the faint outline of figures moving around, almost like they were pacing back and forth. I paused the tape, feeling my skin crawl. I took it to the manager, but when we tried to play it again, the tape was blank. Nothing but static. After that, I couldn't keep working there. I quit the job and never looked back. The project went on without me, and the building was eventually converted into luxury apartments. A few months ago, I drove by the place out of curiosity. There was a news van parked out front. Later that night, I looked up the story online. A resident had gone missing, a young guy who had just moved in. His girlfriend said she woke up one night to find the closet door open and her boyfriend gone. When I saw the picture of the room in the news article, my stomach dropped. The closet was exactly where that hidden hallway had been. I still think about Paul sometimes, wondering if he's stuck in that place, trapped in a hallway that shouldn't exist. I just hope whoever lives there now doesn't stumble into the wrong room, or they might never come out again. I've done contract work for an architectural salvage company for a few years now. The job mostly involves clearing out old buildings before they get torn down, taking anything of value, cataloging unique pieces, that sort of thing. One of the more recent jobs was at an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of the city. It had been closed for decades, left to rot with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. The place had a reputation. Rumors of illegal experiments, patients disappearing, typical urban legend stuff. I never paid much attention to that kind of talk. My focus was getting in, getting the job done, and getting out. I was paired with Tom, one of the newer guys, and we were supposed to clear out the basement level, mostly old medical equipment and furniture. The entrance to the basement was sealed off with a rusted metal door that took a good few minutes to pry open. The air that hit us was thick and stale, like no one had been down there in years. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness. The basement itself was a maze of narrow corridors and small rooms. Most of them had rusted hospital beds or old cabinets. At the far end of the hall, we found a room labeled Records that was locked tight. Tom joked that maybe they kept the ghosts in there, but I wasn't in the mood for jokes. We started moving some of the old filing cabinets when I noticed something strange. The floor under one of them sounded hollow when I tapped it. Curious, I shone my light down and noticed the faint outline of a trapdoor, almost completely covered by dirt and debris. It took both of us to pry it open. Below was a narrow stone staircase leading down into pitch blackness. Tom was reluctant, but I convinced him that if there was something valuable down there, we'd be heroes for finding it. We made our way down slowly, and that's when I noticed the walls, concrete, but lined with scratch marks, like someone had tried to claw their way out. At the bottom, the space opened up into a long, low corridor lined with rusted gurneys. Some were overturned, others still had brittle leather straps hanging from the sides. The smell down there was worse than anything I'd ever encountered, a mix of mold and something sickly sweet. As we moved further in, we noticed something that made our skin crawl. The gurneys weren't empty. They had mannequins strapped to them, covered in medical gowns. Some were positioned in grotesque poses, their plastic limbs bent at unnatural angles. "What the hell is this?" Tom whispered. I had no answer. We kept moving, our footsteps echoing through the tunnel. Suddenly, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping from further down the corridor. We froze, listening. It didn't stop. Tom shone his flashlight ahead, and that's when we saw the door at the end. It looked like it had been welded shut at some point, but the metal was rusted through in places. The tapping came from behind it. I called out, thinking maybe it was just an animal, but the tapping stopped immediately. Silence. Tom insisted we should leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached the door, inspecting the rusted seams, and noticed something. The door had been forcibly bent inward, like something had tried to push it open from the other side. Just as I was about to call it a day, Tom shouted, "What's that?" I turned and saw something on the floor, muddy footprints leading from the door back toward the staircase. They were fresh. I didn't want to admit how scared I was, but I could see Tom's face, pale and wide-eyed. We decided to get out and report what we found. As we hurried back up the staircase, I thought I heard a faint scraping behind us. I didn't dare look back. We made it back to the main level and locked the basement door behind us. I called our boss and told him about the trapdoor and the creepy setup. He promised to send some guys to check it out, but when we came back the next day, the basement entrance had been padlocked with a new chain. Our boss told us the building had been secured and that the developers didn't want anyone going back down there. He didn't explain why, just that we were done with that part of the job. A week later, I saw in the local news that the hospital had caught fire in the middle of the night. By the time firefighters arrived, the entire basement had collapsed, leaving nothing but charred rubble. They never found out what caused the fire, but the story was buried pretty quickly. Tom and I talked about it later, and we couldn't help but wonder, did someone start that fire on purpose? And if so, what the hell did they find down there that made them decide to bury it forever? Even now, whenever I think about that dark, twisted corridor and the mannequins strapped to gurneys, I can't help but feel like we narrowly escaped something we were never meant to see. My friend Ryan and I were always looking for some kind of adventure. Living in a small town didn't give us many options, so we usually ended up exploring old places and abandoned buildings. One day, we heard about an old mansion on the outskirts of town, tucked away behind overgrown trees and a rusted iron gate. It had belonged to some wealthy recluse who passed away decades ago, and the place had been rotting ever since. We'd heard the stories. People claimed it was haunted or that some vagrant had taken up residence. Naturally, we had to check it out. We hopped the gate one late afternoon and pushed through the weeds until we reached the front porch. The windows were grimy and cracked, and the paint peeled from the wooden siding like it was trying to escape. The front door wasn't even locked, just swollen shut from years of moisture. We forced it open with a loud crack, and the musty smell hit us immediately. Inside, the place was filled with old furniture draped in white sheets, dusty chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, and fading portraits lining the walls. It didn't take long to realize something was off. In the foyer, just to the right of the grand staircase, we saw our first sign, a group of porcelain dolls arranged in a neat circle on the floor. Some were missing eyes, and one had a twisted neck, like it had been deliberately broken. Creepy as hell, Ryan muttered. We figured it was just some leftover from when the place had been looted by kids before us, so we moved on. As we wandered through the mansion, we noticed that every room had dolls. Sometimes they were on mantels, other times on chairs, and a few even hung from the ceiling by strings like grotesque marionettes. Each one seemed to be positioned in a way that faced the door, like they were waiting for someone to come in. We started feeling uneasy when we found a room that looked more lived in than the others. The dust on the floor had been disturbed, and there were footprints leading to an old armchair by the fireplace. On a small end table sat a half-empty bottle of water and a peanut butter sandwich, looking relatively fresh. "Someone's definitely been here," Ryan whispered. We looked at each other, debating whether to leave, but curiosity won out. We continued upstairs, but the uneasiness didn't leave us. On the second floor, we found a room that made us both freeze. It was a small study with a single desk and a high-backed chair. On the desk was a radio, quietly playing static. Next to it was a collection of photographs, mostly old black and white portraits of families, but one caught my eye. It was a grainy, faded shot of the mansion itself, taken from the outside. In the bottom corner, someone had scribbled, "Always watching." I felt a chill and turned around, and that's when I saw it, a doll sitting on the windowsill that I hadn't noticed before. Its glass eyes seemed to glint in the low light. As I moved closer, I noticed something small and metallic embedded in one of its eye sockets. A tiny camera. I called Ryan over, and we both looked at it in disbelief. We quickly scanned the other dolls in the room and found two more with similar tiny lenses. Someone had rigged them to function as surveillance cameras. "What the hell is this?" Ryan whispered. We debated leaving, but I had to know more. I pulled the radio closer and adjusted the volume, but the static didn't change. That's when Ryan noticed the small receiver next to it. It was actively scanning, picking up signals from nearby devices. We both realized the same thing at once. Someone was actively monitoring the house. Panic set in, and we bolted for the stairs. As we reached the landing, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The circle of dolls in the foyer had changed. They were now facing the stairs, as if they'd been arranged to watch us come down. I heard the faintest sound behind me, like a floorboard creaking. Ryan turned and shouted, "Run." I didn't look back. We sprinted out of the mansion, through the overgrown yard, and didn't stop until we hit the road. We tried to convince ourselves it was just a prank or some weird art installation, but when we checked online later, we couldn't find any record of the mansion being used for anything recently. The town records said it had been abandoned for over 20 years. The next day, I drove by the gate just to see if anyone was there. A new lock had been placed on it, and a fresh chain was wrapped around the bars. I never went back, but sometimes, when I drive past that road at night, I swear I see a dim light in one of the windows. Ryan and I stopped exploring abandoned places after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd interrupted something we were never meant to see. Or worse, that whoever was watching us that day is still out there, keeping an eye on anyone curious enough to get too close. I work for a small historical preservation group. Our job is to catalog items from old buildings scheduled for demolition, saving anything with historical value. It's usually mundane work, dusty file cabinets, broken furniture, forgotten photographs. But a few months ago, I took a job that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. The building was a state-run juvenile detention center, closed in the early 90s after a series of scandals. It had been rotting on the edge of town for decades, surrounded by a rusty chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. I was supposed to document anything of historical significance before the building was torn down. The air inside was thick with mildew and dust, and the dim light filtering through shattered windows barely made a dent in the shadows. My task for the first day was simple: clear out the administrative offices on the second floor. I found old desks piled high with faded documents, broken typewriters, and decrepit filing cabinets. Most of it was garbage, but I still had to document everything. It wasn't until I was halfway through the second office that I found something strange. In the bottom drawer of a battered metal desk, I discovered a thick journal, the cover cracked and stained. I opened it to find handwriting, notes from one of the staff members, dated right before the center shut down. The entries started off mundane, mostly about daily routines and dealing with the troubled kids. But as I skimmed through, the tone grew darker. The writer, whose name I never found, started mentioning unsettling incidents. Kids waking up with bruises they couldn't explain, staff hearing footsteps at night when no one was supposed to be there. One entry, dated just a week before the facility closed, caught my attention. It described a night shift where the staff heard a loud crash from one of the unused wings. When they went to check it out, they found a broken window and muddy footprints leading from the outside, disappearing into one of the long, dark corridors. They searched for hours but never found anyone. I was about to put the journal back when I heard something. A faint scraping noise from down the hall. My heart rate picked up as I listened, but the noise stopped just as suddenly as it started. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe some debris shifting. I got back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next entry in the journal was even stranger. The writer mentioned finding one of the kids huddled in the corner of his room, muttering that he was watching him sleep. When pressed for details, the boy just cried and wouldn't say more. A few days later, the same boy went missing, and the staff never found him. They suspected he'd run away, but the writer noted that the boy's shoes and jacket were still in his room. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I read, but I kept going. One of the final entries described how the staff had started locking the doors at night because someone or something was leaving muddy footprints throughout the halls. One staff member claimed to have seen a figure lurking near the common area, but when they investigated, they found nothing. As I finished the entry, I heard the scraping noise again, closer this time. I turned around slowly, shining my flashlight down the dim hall. Nothing moved, but I noticed a set of footprints leading from the far end of the hall to just outside the office door. Fresh, muddy footprints. I swallowed the lump in my throat and quickly gathered my things. I decided to head downstairs and take a break. As I made my way through the corridors, I kept hearing faint noises behind me, creaks, rustling, the occasional clink of metal. I tried to convince myself it was just the building settling, but the tension in my chest didn't ease. When I finally reached the lobby, I nearly jumped out of my skin. One of the front doors was ajar. I knew I had locked it behind me when I came in. I rushed outside, my pulse pounding, and called my boss, telling him I was done for the day. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the noises and the footprints in my head. The next morning, I returned to the building with a coworker. I showed him the journal and the footprints, but by then, the mud had dried, blending into the grime on the floor. He shrugged it off as a prank, maybe some kids sneaking in after dark. We finished cataloging the rest of the building in a few days without incident. The journal, along with some old photographs and documents, was sent to the historical archive. A month later, I learned that the demolition crew found something disturbing during their initial inspection, a sealed-off crawl space under the administration building. Inside, they discovered a small bedroll, a stack of cans, and an old pair of muddy boots. No one could explain how someone had been living down there all these years, especially in a building that had been locked up tight. They never found the person. I still wonder if the figure the staff had seen back then was real, and if the same person was still there when I was working alone. Every time I drive past that empty lot now, I can't help but think about the journal, the footprints, and the feeling of being watched. I'm not sure I'll ever take another job in an abandoned building again. I work for a demolition company, and a few months back, we got a contract to tear down an old bank building downtown. It had been abandoned for almost 20 years after the company went bankrupt. The place had been looted long ago, windows smashed, doors busted, and anything remotely valuable already stripped out. We started by gutting the main lobby, tearing out the counters and old furniture. My buddy Mike and I were assigned to clear the offices on the lower floor. Most of the rooms were filled with moldy file cabinets and shredded paperwork. Nothing unusual. Then, while clearing out a storage area, I found something odd, a section of wall that didn't match the rest. It looked newer, like it had been built after the place was abandoned. I called Mike over, and we started knocking on the drywall. It sounded hollow. Curiosity got the better of us. We used a crowbar to chip away the plaster, revealing a massive steel door behind it, a vault door. It was one of those old-school, circular ones with a thick wool handle in the center. The strange thing was, the door looked pristine, not like it had been sitting untouched for 20 years. We radioed the site manager, and he had no record of a second vault on the blueprints. The main vault was on the upper floor, already opened and emptied long before. This one wasn't on any of the plans. Mike and I tried to spin the wheel, but it wouldn't budge. We decided to leave it for the day and focus on clearing out the rest of the area. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled onto something important, or something we weren't supposed to find. The next morning, we came back to the site, but something was off. One of the newer guys, Eddie, looked pale as a ghost. He said he'd been assigned the night shift to secure the place and heard banging noises coming from the lower floor. He thought it was just pipes settling, but it freaked him out when it didn't stop. I didn't think much of it. Old buildings make weird noises. We went back down to the vault door to take some photos for the site report, but when we got there, I froze. The wheel on the vault door had shifted. I swear it had been stuck in the upright position the day before, but now it was angled slightly to the left. Mike thought I was losing it, but Eddie swore up and down he hadn't touched it. We checked the door again, but it was still locked tight. We took some pictures and went back upstairs. That afternoon, we were packing up to leave when I heard it, a faint, metallic banging echoing from the lower floor. I nudged Mike, and we both stood still, listening. It was rhythmic, like someone pounding on the vault door from the inside. We rushed back down, and as we got closer, the banging stopped. Mike was clearly rattled, but I insisted we check it out. The door looked the same, but I noticed something that sent chills through me, a smudge mark on the metal, like someone's hand had been pressed against it. We called the site manager again, who was getting frustrated with our constant updates. He told us to leave it alone and focus on the demolition. We left, but I couldn't get it out of my head. That night, Mike called me from home, his voice shaky. He said he couldn't sleep, kept thinking about that damn door. I told him to get some rest and that we'd figure it out in the morning. When we arrived at the site the next day, Eddie was gone. No one had seen him since his shift the previous night. The site manager shrugged it off, saying he was probably just hungover or quit without telling anyone. We went back to the vault to check it again. This time, the wheel was turned even further. Mike tried to move it, but it wouldn't budge. As we stood there, we heard it again, the banging, louder this time. It was definitely coming from the other side of the vault door. We called the cops, worried that maybe someone had gotten trapped. They brought in a locksmith to crack the vault open. It took hours, and the whole time, the banging continued, growing more frantic. Finally, the door creaked open, and we braced ourselves for whatever was inside. But the vault was empty. Just bare concrete walls, a dusty floor, and nothing else. One of the cops pointed out something strange, fresh footprints in the dust, leading from the door to the back wall. They looked like work boots, and my stomach sank. They matched the ones Eddie always wore. The cops searched the entire building, but there was no sign of him. The site manager ordered us to seal the vault again, saying the city didn't want any more delays. We bolted it shut and covered the entrance with plywood. A few days later, demolition began. I couldn't be there. I told Mike I was sick. That night, I had a nightmare about the vault door, hearing that relentless banging, louder and louder, until the door burst open. A week after the building came down, I saw Eddie's face on a missing person flyer. No one's seen him since that night. Sometimes I think I hear faint banging when I'm alone, and it makes my skin crawl. I still wonder what really happened. Did Eddie somehow get trapped behind that door? Or was there something else down there, waiting to be released? I'll never know, but one thing's for sure. I don't take demolition jobs near old vaults anymore. I was hired to clean out an old, condemned theater downtown. It had been a staple of the city back in the 1950s, hosting movie premieres and community events, but by the time I got there, it was nothing but a decaying shell. The city planned to tear it down and build a parking lot, but first, they needed the inside cleared. My job was to go in, catalog any historical items worth saving, and get rid of the rest. The place was eerie from the start. The marquee was barely readable, most of the letters missing or hanging by a thread. Inside, the lobby was a mess of broken glass and torn-up carpet, and the smell of mildew was almost overwhelming. The concession stand was still there, but all the equipment had been stripped out, leaving behind rusted metal frames. The first few days were uneventful. I started with the main auditorium, where most of the seats had been ripped out, leaving jagged rows of exposed bolts. The massive screen was still hanging, though stained and riddled with holes. I couldn't help but imagine the place in its prime, filled with excited moviegoers. One morning, I was clearing out the balcony seating when I noticed something strange. Up in the projection room, a dim light was flickering. I knew I'd cut the power on the first day for safety reasons. At first, I thought it was just the sunlight reflecting off a broken window, but as I moved closer, I realized it was definitely coming from inside. I climbed the creaky stairs to the projection room, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I was hit with a musty smell different from the rest of the theater, almost like stale cigarette smoke. Inside, I found a small space cluttered with old film reels, broken projectors, and stacks of crumpled movie posters. On the floor was a sleeping bag, neatly rolled up, and a few empty cans of food. I took a closer look at the flickering light and realized it was an old film projector, still partially operational. A strip of film dangled from the reel, caught in the gears. I didn't remember seeing the projector on before, and I was pretty sure I hadn't gone up to the room since the first day. As I inspected the machine, I found something even more unsettling, a notebook sitting on the windowsill. Its pages were filled with cramped handwriting, mostly scribbled notes about movies and detailed sketches of the theater itself. But there was something else, paranoid rants about being watched, about shadows moving through the aisles, and about someone else living in the theater. I felt a prickling at the back of my neck and turned around. The room was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I quickly snapped some pictures of the room and the notebook with my phone before heading back downstairs. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The theater had been locked up tight when I first arrived, and as far as I knew, I was the only one with keys. I tried convincing myself that maybe a homeless person had found a way in before I started working there. Still, something about those notes made me uneasy. The next day, I went back up to the projection room to take more photos, but when I got there, the notebook was gone. The sleeping bag was unrolled and flattened out on the floor. I swore I hadn't touched it the day before. I checked the rest of the room, but nothing else seemed disturbed. I radioed the foreman and asked if anyone else had been in the building overnight, but he just laughed and said I was the only one crazy enough to be there at all. I decided to lock the projection room and focus on the lobby instead. A few hours later, while I was clearing out the concession area, I heard a faint noise, like muffled talking. I stopped, straining to listen. It was coming from the balcony. I crept up the steps, trying to be as quiet as possible. As I reached the top, the voices stopped. When I stepped into the balcony area, I noticed something new, an old radio set up on one of the seats, quietly playing static. I hadn't seen it there before, and it was definitely still working. I picked it up, trying to figure out if it had been left on a timer or something. That's when I noticed the back of the radio, it was missing batteries. My heart pounded as I turned it off. I glanced around, but the room was empty. I left the radio where I found it and hurried downstairs. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Later that afternoon, I made a run to the hardware store for some supplies. When I came back, I noticed something odd about the door. The padlock was in a different position than how I'd left it. I cautiously entered, calling out to see if anyone was there. Silence. I moved through the lobby and back up to the balcony. As I reached the top, I saw it. The radio was gone. My stomach dropped. I knew I hadn't touched it, and no one else had keys. I started feeling seriously paranoid, convinced someone was messing with me. As I descended the stairs, I heard something that made my blood run cold, the faint hum of the projector coming from the room above. I froze on the spot. Slowly, I made my way back up and pushed the door open. The projector was running, casting static flickering on the torn screen below. I moved closer, noticing a new note taped to the machine. "You're not supposed to be here." I didn't even bother turning the projector off. I bolted down the stairs, out the door, and straight to my truck. I called the foreman and told him I wasn't coming back. He thought I was joking until I sent him the photos. The next day, he sent a few other guys to clear out the place. They didn't find any evidence of anyone staying there. No sleeping bag, no radio, not even the notebook. It was as if I'd imagined the whole thing. The theater was demolished the following week, and I tried to put it out of my mind. But a month later, I saw a news article about a man found living in another condemned building downtown. He was scribbling notes about being watched and carrying an old radio that played nothing but static. I still think about that theater sometimes, and I can't help but wonder if he was the one messing with me, or if he was just another victim of that creepy, forgotten place. I'll never know, but I still get chills whenever I pass by the empty lot where the theater used to stand. My friend Eric and I are always looking for new spots to explore. We're not exactly urban explorers, but we get a kick out of checking out abandoned places, old factories, shut down schools, stuff like that. One night, we heard about an old motel on the outskirts of town that had been closed for years. It was a popular spot back in the day, but a string of violent incidents forced it to shut down in the early 2000s. Now it was just a crumbling, forgotten relic on the side of the highway. Eric convinced me it would be cool to check it out. He'd heard from a guy at work that the place was creepy as hell, with graffiti all over the walls and broken windows everywhere. Plus, there were rumors that the owner just locked the doors one day and left everything as it was. Clothes in the closets, sheets on the beds, even the front desk register still open. We drove out around midnight, figuring we'd get some good footage for our channel. The place looked worse than I expected. The sign out front, once neon pink and blue, was now just a rusted frame hanging by a single bolt. The parking lot was overgrown with weeds, and the front door hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze. We parked a little down the road, grabbed our flashlights, and crept inside. The lobby was a mess. The old counter covered in dust and grime. A few torn chairs scattered around. The walls were tagged with graffiti, most of it just random phrases and gang symbols. Eric laughed as he pointed out one particularly crude drawing on the wall. We started with the ground floor rooms. Most were unlocked, their doors either kicked in or hanging off the hinges. Inside, we found the usual signs of decay: peeling wallpaper, mold creeping up the walls, and a few smashed TVs. A couple of rooms still had beds with yellowed sheets, and one even had a suitcase left open on the floor, full of moth-eaten clothes. We worked our way through the first building before moving on to the second one. It was a two-story structure with outdoor corridors. We went room by room, checking each one, filming bits and pieces. Nothing too exciting, just more of the same. Then we got to the end of the second floor. Room 213 was different. Unlike the others, it was locked tight with a heavy padlock on the handle. The door itself looked newer than the others, as if it had been replaced recently. We glanced at each other. Curiosity immediately piqued. Eric grinned, already pulling out his multi-tool. It took some effort, but eventually, the padlock snapped, and we pushed the door open. The smell hit us first, musty, but not like the other rooms. It smelled almost clean, like it had been recently aired out. Inside, the room was intact, completely untouched. The bed was made with crisp white sheets, the TV on the dresser looked almost new, and a single suitcase sat on the bed, partially unzipped. On the small table by the window, there was a half-empty bottle of water and a local newspaper dated just a few days earlier. "What the hell?" I whispered, feeling a chill creep up my spine. Eric looked around, shining his light at the ceiling, the corners, anywhere a camera might be hidden. "This isn't right," he muttered. I moved to the bathroom door and slowly pushed it open. Inside, the sink was clean, the toilet lid down, and a single toothbrush sat in a cup on the counter. I called Eric over, and he immediately noticed the same thing I did. The faucet was slightly dripping. We both turned as we heard a noise from the hallway, like soft footsteps. I killed my light, and we stayed silent, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Then a slow, deliberate knock. Eric mouthed, "What the fuck?" I motioned for him to stay quiet. After a few seconds, we heard the footsteps continue down the corridor. I glanced out the small, grimy window to the parking lot, but it was empty. We waited for a few minutes before moving again. Eric was already talking about how we needed to get out, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I approached the suitcase and carefully unzipped it the rest of the way. Inside were neatly folded clothes, shirts, jeans, socks, all clean and smelling faintly of detergent. Then I noticed something odd, a photo album tucked into a side pocket. I pulled it out and flipped it open. The pictures inside were of the motel, taken from different angles: the lobby, the parking lot, the other rooms. The last few photos showed room 213 itself, the bed perfectly made. The final photo made my blood run cold. It was a picture of me and Eric, taken just minutes earlier from the parking lot as we walked toward the building. I showed it to Eric, and his face went pale. "We're not alone here," he whispered. Just then, the TV flickered on by itself, displaying static. We both jumped back, and that's when we noticed the suitcase had shifted slightly on the bed, like someone had moved it. We didn't waste any more time. We bolted out of the room, rushing down the stairs, not bothering to lock the door behind us. As we made it to the car, I glanced back up at the balcony. Room 213's door was closed, the padlock replaced. We peeled out of there, not stopping until we were miles down the highway. Once we felt safe, I pulled out my phone to check the footage we'd shot. To my surprise, most of the video from room 213 was corrupted, nothing but distorted audio and pixelated images. The only clear shot was of the photo album, specifically the picture of us approaching the motel. A week later, I checked the local news out of curiosity. A brief article mentioned that the old motel had been torn down due to safety concerns. No mention of anyone living there, no reports of squatters. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that room. Who locked it? Who took that photo? And most disturbing of all, why did it look like someone had been waiting for us?